Brad, so good
Eh,
to see you. Thank you for joining us.
Pleasure is mine. Good to see you as well. With all the awards, it's very exciting there.
Appreciate it. Some of them are due to you, pal, so thank you.
You're too kind.
So, would you begin by just introducing yourself and your company?
Sure. So I work at a law firm. It's a top 100 law firm. We're based in Philadelphia, but have 30 offices, a full service law firm. I My focus is on development. So I tend to represent owners, sponsors, developers that buy land, build buildings. They also buy buildings and adaptively reuse them. So I help them in that endeavor. I help them get them financed. I help them with incentives, both federal and state incentives, including like the Inflation Reduction Act and the Build Back Better Act, and state sort of equivalents. And I spend some time working on, affordable housing for special needs adults. And I also spend a bunch of time on the quixotic journey of, trying to convince some developer types that sustainability and energy efficiency and water conservation are appropriate, good, for not only their buildings, but for kind of writ large, the environment, and why that's relevant to them. So it depends on the day, but we're doing all that on any particular day.
Well, thank you. I know you're really good at that stuff, and I appreciate you being with us today.
Pleasure.
So, as we move forward, why do you care about sustainability?
It's a good question, actually. I hadn't thought about that. I just think that there are, it's kind of like, why do you give to charity? Similar to me. Maybe it's different, but it's a bit of because we can. I mean, the taking sort of personal responsibility for our own actions, and then our family, and then our extended family. So if you can do something that is better for the person across the street and isn't injurious to you, why wouldn't you do that? So if it didn't take too much time, it doesn't cost too much money, why wouldn't you do that? And so that this journey, which has been, I don't know, 15, 20 years, I was going to say you and I had hair, but we probably didn't have hair back then. Um, it's ever evolving. There's ever more things to do. There's always other people to assist and to help. And, this isn't like Pollyanna. It's not like, just because I want to sit there and, give away everything. That's not me either. But it's more, I feel like we can do things in a way that are more beneficial to the people that we come in contact with, whether that's customers, whether it's vendors, whether it's, people that are building the buildings, whether it's people kind of walking down the street. There are any number of things we can do in a better fashion, more efficient fashion, that have a better outcome for a lot of people. And so I think that that's what's interesting to me. And in this space, if we define this space as sustainability, kind of risk mitigation, resiliency type stuff, I think that there's just, I meet interesting, fascinating people that are doing like incredible things, and that keeps me interested in learning. And so that's what it's a bit about.
Thank you. And I know you're making a difference, so thank you. So, I know you spend a lot of time professionally and personally working on the issue of sustainability and green buildings and what have you. Can you give us sort of a broad overview on the evolution of sustainability reporting?
You know, when you look at kind of sustainability, across the world, um, it starts with ecology, which is when Steve and I were young, whippersnappers. The notion of ecology, like what's happening to the environment, what's happening to the world. And so there are places that are ahead of us. So Australia kind of latched onto that first, the EU a bit second, Canada third, the United States is fourth, but a distant fourth, I would say. Kind of 5 years, although we're playing catch up. I think over the last 5 years, we've done some really good stuff. So I think that it starts with, how are we measuring? How are we monitoring? How are we verifying information relative to things? Things in this instance being, on the E side, at least, water, waste, energy, trash, What are we doing with chemicals in the buildings? How are we cleaning buildings and what chemicals are we using? What are we using outside, when we have landscaping? So how much water are we using there and what kind of fertilizer are we putting down? And not only what are we doing there, like where does it go? So when we put it into the ground, who cares? Well, we should care because it gets into the soil, then it gets into the water streams, and then it starts to affect the fish, and then we eat the fish. And it sounds like Pollyanna, but it's not. I mean, it's just like real stuff. Fish are being impacted worldwide. And so, that discussion, what are we doing individually? What are then the buildings doing? What's the community doing? What impact is it having on the environment? And how do we measure that? And so there's different methodologies to capture that information. So are we doing it on a spreadsheet? Are we doing it in a computer system? If it's just Steve's house or Brad's house, that's one thing, which is not easy to get to either. But, because your bills are coming 30 days late and they're telling you consumption like backwards and the charts don't make any sense. And, what are you buying? What is a therm? What does that mean? And so, are we talking about at a single place or are we talking about as a real estate company, you own multiple buildings and millions of square feet? And so, each individual act builds to a lot of individual acts, but when you have a portfolio of a couple 100 million feet, that definitely builds to a particular place relatively quickly. And so there are, to your question, different reporting methodologies on how are we, what are we measuring and monitoring. And so those continue to evolve. There are different science-based targets that people look at. There are different reporting methodologies. So there used to be, the CDP, which stands for Carbon Disclosure Project, and GRI, the Global Research Initiative, I believe. And so they had different reporting methodologies. They then kind of combined into this group called ISSB, which was also working with it's like the alphabet soup of acronyms here. They were working with the Sustainable Accounting Standards Board. So if we sort of step back from the discussion, there's a FASB, the Financial Accounting Standards Board. It's an international group that kind of pronounces judgment on what financial statements are supposed to look like. Well, the SASB was like an offshoot of that. Not same people, but how do we measure sustainability internationally so that when we're looking at something in Argentina, it's the same as in Maine, which is the same as in Italy. And so how do you do that? And so the SASB started that conversation. And then while they had sort of helped with the CDP and GRI, they then morphed into another reporting methodology. So again, there's been a lot of shifting sands over the last 5-7 years in this reporting front. But now the EU has a reporting standard that they're looking for. Canada has a reporting standard it's looking for. The SEC issued its final rules, 2 weeks ago at this point. Put aside the litigation that's ensued around it. They have a reporting methodology and they're all trying to get to a similar place so that if Steve is reporting in California, it's the same as in Maine, which would be the same as in Italy, which would be the same as in Australia. That we're not there yet. So there's a variety of different reporting methodologies, which drive some of my friends and colleagues nuts. But most of the folks who are looking for the reports to come to them, are open to utilizing similar methodologies so that you're not doing different things for different countries.
Let me build on that just a little bit.
Sure.
Recently, the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, introduced their sustainability or climate-related risk
disclosure
requirements. Yep. Thank you. And I know you're one of the few people that have actually read the 850 pages or so Federal Registry or whatever document that was. And you did a webinar on this to help people like myself better understand everything that's going on. And with your permission, I'd like to be able to share that recording with our group. But can you briefly share your major takeaways from what the SEC is requiring?
Yeah, so that, as Steve said, that was a whole hour webinar. So it's going to be a little bit difficult to sort of truncate that to very short sound bites, but I shall try. Before we dive into that, though, the SEC has been working on this for quite some time. They issued proposed rules. Those proposed rules were commented on, which is typical, publicly commented on. They got more public comments on this set of proposed rules than on anything that they've ever done before. Over 10,700, comment letters. So they worked for a long time to issue final rules, and there was some debate over when those final rules were going to be enacted. They were enacted and promulgated like 3 weeks ago. Okay, so they get issued, as Steve said, in the Federal Register is where we publish laws, and they become effective after a certain period of time. So those rules in final form, based on input from the comments, they changed some of the rules that they had proposed 10 months, 12 months earlier. And within 24 hours, there were 8 lawsuits filed by a variety of people. And then 3 days later, there were 12 lawsuits filed by others, oil and gas and some state or attorney generals, as you can well imagine. And ironically, or not ironically, by some of the environmental groups. So the oil and gas and other folks are saying you went too far. The, Wildlife Federation said you didn't go far enough. And so, there's this battle going on right now. It was consolidated into the Eighth Circuit. So the Eighth Circuit has taken all these different cases, combined them into one, and they are reviewing to issue a final ruling on, did the SEC go too far? Did it not go far enough? And what does that mean? So right now we have this final set of rules that are kind of stuck in ether for the moment until the Eighth Circuit rules on them. Okay. With that as, guidance or sort of where we're at currently, the rules did a variety of things. What they were trying to do, at least in the SEC's parlance, is they're trying to give what the SEC has governance over is required disclosure for purposes of investors that are reviewing public companies. Okay. So when Steve, Brad go to invest in Tesla, Sunoco, it doesn't matter, any of the public companies, there's a set of rules that those companies are required to follow that the SEC has promulgated, modified over time. And the idea is that every investor is supposed to be on the same level playing field as every other investor. Nobody should have an unfair advantage. And so what the SEC is constantly looking at is there something that our investors that we're supposed to be protecting should have in order to make more informed decisions? And so their view was that they were hearing from a lot of investors that wanted to hear more about climate change and disclosure relative to the public companies that they were going to invest in. And that wasn't going to be the only thing they were looking at, but the investor, but they wanted that as one piece of information that they could take into account when deciding whether to invest or not. And so these rules are, as Steve said, there's an explanation of here's the old rule, here's the commentator's discussion, here's the new rule that's final. And that stuff is like 875 pages long. And yes, I got my way through the entire thing, which was nuts. But it's interesting because what it gave is kind of the rationale for why the SEC was taking these various positions and modified some and strengthened others. And so, again, the 20,000 foot thing is, in their view, they're trying to equalize the playing field for the investor because the investor was interested in this and they thought that there wasn't enough being disclosed. And they're trying to provide a methodology for disclosing that. And so that disclosure finds its way into public filings that have legal ramifications. So a 10Q, a 10K. And it also finds its way into certain footnote disclosures in the financial statements of these public companies. So does it just affect the public companies? Yes, for now. But, anybody that's in their orbit that they need information from in order to make informed decisions about their own stuff, these public companies are going to start asking questions if they're not already. And so many more than just the public company are going to get asked by those public companies for things in order for the public company to make a determination on, is climate change for us, the company, material? So a lot of this comes down to, we look at a broad, swath of things. We determine for us as a company, is it material? If it's not material, the SEC says, then you don't need to report it. If it is material, you need to report it in thus and such a way. And they've given you kind of a rule book to do that. There was a lot of conversation around, your audience is probably familiar with scope 1, scope 2, scope 3. Scope 1, kind of the energy you use in your building. Scope 2, the energy you bring in, from utilities to your building. And then scope 3, the energy greenhouse gas emissions that are emitted in connection with your supply chain. So raw materials that you need for your product, packaging that you need for your product, anything that you're bringing in for what you do. So it could be computers, it could be pencils, it could be anything that you're using in order to do what you do as a business. And so that last thing, how does your supply chain impact greenhouse gas emissions? Well, if you're a big company, there's a lot of people in your supply chain. And so how do you get all those people to give you that information? That's a little bit tricky. And people were, kind of hand wringing and teeth gnashing. And so the SEC, as part of its final rule, said, yeah, okay, you know what? We've heard that. We're not going to require scope 3 disclosure. So scope 3, your supply chain, we're going to put off till the future, if at all. But scope 1 and 2, what do you do? And what are the utilities that you're bringing in? What do they do? We want disclosure there. And we want you to take that into account in dealing with, is it material to not only you, the company, but to the financial performance of the company? And so they're now requiring a company to look at a variety of things, not the least of which would be weather-related incidents. And they listed, kind of the standard 10, kind of thing. So like hurricanes, flood, coastal impact, wildfires, drought, all of these things. They're asking these companies to say, okay, look at those. Did they affect your property? If so, how much? Dollars wise. So they're converting it from a thing to how much dollar impact. Okay, so takeaway, companies are going to need to have systems in place to measure what's going on, to monitor these weather events, to then disclose and determine first, is it material? And then if it's material, how much is it? So, how the board reacts, how the senior management reacts, what expertise they have, all relevant. Scope 1 and 2, relevant. How at some point in the future, 2031 and 33, these companies are going to need to have a third party look at their information and verify that what they're saying is true. So to diminish greenwashing, kind of people making statements and not sort of following through. And so the SEC, again, big picture, they're focusing on company. We're not telling you if it's material or not. We're telling you, you need to make a determination on whether it's material, it being, climate disclosure. And if it is, you then need to disclose in a certain way kind of what those impacts are to not only the company, but the financial statements.
So what would your recommendations be for companies just getting started with sort of looking at materiality, looking at sustainability reporting, looking at the need to report to their major clients or help their major clients? Any thoughts of how these companies just getting started should start?
If you're just getting started, what I would do is online, there are any number of reports. I would start to look at people's corporate social responsibility reports that they've been issuing for the last, decade in certain circumstances. So the Fortune 100 and 500 have been doing this for a while. They're going to need to modify what they did, but I would start to look at those because then you'll start to see what kind of information they're going to need from you as a supplier. Number 2, I would start to think about how can I get as a company, how can I get information on the things that I consume? So water, how much water am I consuming? How much energy am I consuming and where's it coming from? How much waste am I generating? So how much, it may start with how much am I paying and then convert that to how much tonnage is being taken out to the landfill, to being recycled, that kind of stuff. And what am I kind of using in my office, in my manufacturing process? So, how many people do I have? Or are they commuting to work? Are they taking a car? What kind of car? So there's a lot to unpack there. I would start there: water, waste, energy, maybe even chemicals on the cleaning side. And I would start to figure out data streams. Where can I get that information, and where can I start to record it? Whether you record it on a spreadsheet, on a pad of paper, or on a computer system, all of those things are available. And those are the things that, once you have that data, there are computer programs that will allow you to convert that to greenhouse gas emissions. That's scope 1, scope 2 kind of stuff. But if you don't have the information, you can't do anything. So starting with water, waste, and energy is the starting place, I think, for these companies, seeing what others are doing to sort of see what they're going to be looking for, but understanding that for the moment, if you're supplying a public company, they're not going to be coming to you for scope 3, which would be all of the greenhouse gas emissions you create in giving them stuff, selling them stuff. So your trucking, your average, all that stuff. They're not going to be asking for that yet. But I would start to ask them, are you going to be reporting? If so, what can we do to be helpful so that we are prepared for being able to give you this information? So what information is material to you, company? What's germane to you? So pick your biggest 10 companies, because they could get impacted and then you would get impacted. So what do I mean by that? So the SEC, as we just talked about, they're not requiring scope 3. They're not requiring supply chain. That doesn't mean that it ends there. So because certain states have gotten frustrated with the federal government over time, one state in particular, not surprisingly, California, who tends to be at the bleeding edge of kind of climate, yes, and also of kind of environmental rules. California got sick of waiting for all intents and purposes, and so at the end of 23, passed 3 bills. One of which requires companies in California to report their risk-based analysis of what climate change creates by way of risk to their operations in California. So everybody's got to do that in California. So you got to be paying attention. Companies in California that have done 500 million and $1 billion. So there's like 5,300 companies that have done $500 million worth of business. There's another 1,500 companies that have done over $1 billion. And these are times. So meaning the disclosure of risks is in effect for 2024. It will probably slide to 2025, but 2024. The $500 million, company impact is in 2025, and the $1 billion impact is in 2026. Those companies in California that are doing business over 500 million and over $1 billion are required to, as of 25, 26, or 26, 27, required to report not only scope 1 and 2, like the SEC said, but you're required to report scope 3. So anybody that's doing business, deep to your point, with California-based companies that are at that close to 500 or close to $1 billion, they're not going to take a risk. They're going to say we're in until told otherwise. You are in our supply chain. You need to tell us what's your greenhouse gas impact, because we need to use that information in determining what's material to us. And Mr. or Miss Company, it could be small company, it could be big company, it could be medium. If you can't tell us, it's not that we don't love you, it's not that we don't like you. We can't afford to wait for you, because we are required to report to the state. And if we don't, we get fined. And those fines add up. And so, yes, the SEC took scope 3 out, not relevant for the moment, not relevant for a couple of years at least. But if you're doing business with companies that do business in California, which is like the 9th largest economy in the world, you might get swept in anyway, because the rules are going to sweep in scope 3. Okay, so you got to be paying attention to, where do the companies that I provide services to or goods to, where do they operate? Now, again, if they're operating in California, you will have gotten a survey already asking you questions. And so that's a sit down with people or a Zoom call or, Teams, whatever, to find out like, what is it you really need? How quickly do you need it? How can I be helpful? Or you're going to get, unfortunately, left because they don't have time to talk to 1,000 people to educate them on, what we're talking about.
There's a lot in there.
Yeah. In particular, again, California's not going to, so right now, that's California. They're not going to be the only one to do that. I mean, there's going to be other states that will likely follow their lead. My guess is that they'll be mostly East Coast states. But for the moment, it's California. You got to keep your eye on those. As I said earlier, the sands continue to shift. Other states may follow California's lead and, start to push on this just as hard. The SEC, if it ever changed its rule to include Scope 3, that would sort of pull you right back in as well. So it behooves people to start to measure, monitor, and figure out a verification system so that they're not scrambling when it comes to these questionnaires, and they have a system already in place to make that happen.
Well, and I have to say that I also have this belief that what's the saying, you can't manage what you don't measure.
Yeah.
And for so many things, people really don't pay attention to their energy bills, to their water bills. It's a necessary part of doing business, and operationally, it's a big expense. So they try to minimize it, of course. Same thing with transportation and some of these other things. But at the end of the day, I'd like to think this is good business, right? Because when we start measuring it, we can start identifying opportunities for improvement, right? Otherwise, we're just kind of moseying on our way without really having good data to make informed decisions.
Yeah, look, where you and I crossed paths and continue to cross paths, 15 years ago plus was, the cost of chemicals in an office building are not significant. So people don't really look at that. Should they? That's a whole other question. But like, you sort of say, well, okay, I'm very careful in my home to not like open the bleach can and leave it open for like 6 hours, or you like pass out in your house. Well, people don't have that same degree of focus, in the office building for whatever reason. And so, because it's not statistically overly expensive to clean a building, and the chemical part of that is small, people don't pay attention to that. Well, let's sort of say, well, okay, let's turn that on its head. There's an opportunity there. If we could buy stuff that didn't have chemicals in it that were bad for the cleaner, bad for the people that were in the building, and bad for the environment, well, if I could do that for like a no cost ad, well, why wouldn't I do that? The cost you told me just now was not that expensive. So if I could change that out and do it over 100,000 feet, and then do it over 1,000,000 feet, and then do it over 30 million feet, why wouldn't I do that? But to your point, unless you know what's there, unless you know what you're buying, unless you're tracking it, you wouldn't know. And it's like kind of whisper down the lane. Nobody really pays attention to that. And yet they can, and they should. And it's again, I don't want to proselytize, but it's not that hard. It's sitting down with like an expert like yourself and sort of saying, okay, what are we buying? What's in there? Do we have alternatives that are less off-gassing and less problematic to the cleaner and to the occupant? Yes, no. Everybody, all these cleaning supply companies have gotten smart over the last 20 years, most of them, I think, and they have alternate products. But, I had to be educated by you that, yes, I can get these products. They're all like the same cost. You just have to ask. And people aren't used to asking. And so the more informed you are, to your point, the better armed you are relative to it does not cost more, and we can get a better result for not only the people cleaning the building, but the people in the building, God forbid. And so, that's doable. It's not hard. It's just asking.
And I think that just like they're trying to address climate risk, right, and trying to determine what's material, right, what's important, the same concepts apply to what we're doing in the cleaning industry, right? You talked about using products that are safer or whatever. It is, again, about reducing risk to our occupants, risk to our workers, risk to the environment, and deciding what's material, tracking it, looking for opportunities for improvement.
Yeah. And again, that it runs the gamut. It's not only the chemicals. It's like, what equipment are we using? how are we getting the worker, to the building? Because most of the time, as you know, and I'm sure your audience knows, the workers aren't employed by the building owner. They are, staff that gets employed on multiple buildings. And so how do they get there? Are they traveling like 30 miles to get there? And, what are they getting paid? And how is that affordable? And is it affordable to them? And, are they being taken care of if they're only working like, if the employer is only forcing them to work 39 and a half hours, so they don't have benefits? That's all part of this conversation on, what's appropriate. I'm not going to define that for, you. Everybody's got kind of got their own definition, but being at least aware of it, having the conversation around, what are we paying? What can we afford? What's realistic? And should somebody be required to do this, for that kind of dollar? I mean, it's all part of that conversation. What kind of training people are being given, benefits. We talked about healthcare, all that kind of stuff. It's not new. It's kind of what people have been talking about for a long time. It's what the discussion around living wages are about. Some people are in favor of that. Some people are not in favor of that. But to just ignore it is, a bit odd in these days. Forget whether it's wokeism or not wokeism. It's talking about like kind of decency relative to people and what their wages are to come and help and assist, with certain tasks in the building. I don't know. I guess it sounded a little socialistic there, but.
Well, but I think just, again, referring back to what the SEC is doing, they simply recognize that there are investors and other stakeholders who just are looking for more information so that they can make an informed decision, right? The SEC is not forcing people to
Correct.
change business practices, to do any of these things. It's just to provide additional information beyond the standardized financial reporting so that those investors and others who care about, if they're in an area where there's going to be hurricanes or floods, that it may affect where they buy or where they invest. And the same thing relative to the cleaning industry. There will be investors and building owners and other customers who are looking for more information, not merely just what is the cost per square foot or the cost for a gallon of all-purpose cleaner, but will want to know more about who they're buying from, all these other issues, to reduce the risk that perhaps they won't have half their cleaners show up, or the increase in fuels will have a detrimental impact on delivery costs of products, or will jack up the cost of plastic materials and those kind of things. So it's just getting to the information to make more informed decisions.
I think that's spot on. That clearly, so you heard it. That is the takeaway, which is it's not every investor has to care about this. It's many were asking. We're going to hopefully give it to them to allow them to decide how important it is or not important in making their more informed decisions on where to invest their money. And so you sort of say, well, look, I can decide to invest in a hurricane-ridden area or not. That's up to me. But the more information I have about, well, what has that property owner done in that area? Are they being thoughtful about like where their mechanical equipment is? Do they have insurance to cover this? How much? If there's a flood event, what would happen and what's their plan? The more the investor understands about that, the more they feel comfortable or not with respect to a particular owner and what their plans are. And that's, again, to your point, that's exactly, the SEC is not saying you have to do this. They're saying it's up to you to decide and your investors whether they want this information and whether it's material. If it's material, you have to disclose it. It's up to them to decide whether they care or don't. And some people are asking, not everywhere, not every town, but some people are asking, and more people are asking over time. And so, to your point, it's a lens to review data from. It's not the only lens, and they're not saying you have to look at it. They're saying we think that this is relatively important for most ordinary, reasonable, prudent investors. We're not saying that every single one has to. We're not saying that it's going to be important to every company. Because if you own in a particular area that doesn't have floods, fires, hurricanes, weather events, God bless you. But if you're living in there and you make the informed decision that, hey, we've looked at all this information, we have a system to review this and look at it, and our board has this level of impact, and our senior management does this and has this expertise, we don't think it's material, but we've got all this in place. Then that would, again, inform the investor as to what they've done or not done, and whether their decision that it's not material is appropriate. That's where it'll get kind of interesting over time.
Thank you. Last question for you, pal.
Yeah.
We've covered a lot. Any final thoughts? Anything else you'd like to share?
So I hope the Phillies win over 100 games, number one. Number two, I do think, as you know, so I do a monthly call on sustainability where I bring in experts like you and others to talk about different topics. And, strange, odd people tune in and they listen, and, I don't know what the hell they're doing, but they're tuning in. And I think I want to leave the folks that listen in on your stuff with the following, which is, again, I don't think it's like a, kind of star chamber. I don't think we're talking to each other to just hear each other. It's possible. So it's possible, but it's like guard against that, but it's possible. But I do feel like over the last 2.5 years when I've been hosting these calls, the amount of guests, so I typically have 3 or 4 guests on, the amount of guests that have said that people, John Q. Public, Sally Q. Public, the amount of people that are interested, whether they are investors, whether they are owners, whether they are government regulators, whether they are our kids who are getting older, to the person, there's been only a handful, and I do mean a handful, of people that said, nah, it's less relevant today than it was before. The screaming majority of people that have come on the program have said that what we're talking about is more germane, more relevant to them, and that the pace of that is picking up. And so I think that the conversation is relevant. I think it's fascinating. I think we need to all do more. It's a whole other conversation. But the fact that we're having the conversation is where it starts. Education, information, verifiable information that, whether you believe that, we are causing climate change or not. I have a point of view there, but that's less relevant. What's relevant is when you track the number of weather-related events in the last 5 years, it's markedly up, and the amount of dangerous impact has gone up from it used to be very rare to have $1 billion event. We now have $10 billion events, and we have 10 of them in the United States a year. And so that's objective data. That's not me or you putting that out there. That's an insurance company saying, here's the impact that we've had to these assets. And so the takeaway is more people are paying attention, more people care. I think more owners, more investors, more regulatory pressure, the SEC, is being put to bear on the topic. And so that will just continue that cycle of folks paying attention. And I think more and more over time are going to be paying attention and asking for this kind of information and demanding it. And so, bringing it to your audience is important so that they can get prepared for how do I present this and what do I have to say and, what's there. Because it's going to take a little bit of time to unpack that. But the small, medium companies shouldn't be put out to pasture because they don't understand it right now. They need to quickly start to understand it and be prepared to report on it. Because I think more and more people are going to be asking about that.
So, Brad, thank you very much for spending time with us. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you, pal.